Okay, the meeting is now being recorded, and I will bring back this note pod number 5 at the end, especially if somebody reminds me, and then that way you can copy and paste. You should be able to select that and copy and paste those dates and contact information. So today we're talking about timber harvesting. I've subtitled this Good Intentions versus Effective Execution. There's a lot of details that go into timber harvesting, and timber harvesting is too specific. It should really be forest harvesting, because we might be talking about pulpwood, we might be talking about firewood, and it's within the, some of it's going to relate to is going to be mostly on the commercial side, so if you're trying to sell some kind of a product, but there are applications here if this is something you're doing yourself for your own utilization as well. There are a couple of items. One particular item, the first half of the presentation is going to be talking about the in the woods kinds of activities, who talks to who and how is wood sold. The second half of the presentation is about the timber sale contract. Cornell University has a sample or example timber sale contract. Lots of places have examples of these. If you go and do a Google search and just type in timber sale contract, you'll get lots of options. If you go to my web page, ignore this second bullet. Let me see if I can turn this on. Ignore this second bullet here. If you just go to my Forest Connect website and go to the publications, then you'll see that. You'll see that there's a sample there, and there are some other ones here. You can copy and paste those. Okay, let's, as we do with a lot of these, I'd like to start with a couple of quick polls just to see who's out there and who's listening, and if you can let me know a little about yourself. This is actually, there are 2 questions here, so you'll answer once in the top end, whether or not you're a landowner, a forester, educator, or other, and then if on the bottom section, if you could let me know if there are, what your participation in workshops have been. So let's take a few minutes to pound through those. Okay, I'm assuming everybody's figuring out how to do this. You just click in the box, the little square box to the left of the statement that you agree with, and go back and forth. And you should be able to, I'm assuming that everyone is able to click on more than one box. Is that correct? Okay, when I talk about a seminar, I'm talking about an in-person seminar where you go to a school or a high school or a fire hall or an extension office or a soil and water office, and you can see the person who's giving the presentation. The last 2 questions where I talk about a webcast is what we're doing today currently. Essentially what I'm trying to get at with the questions of seminars versus webcasts is whether the people who are participating in webcasts do that exclusively, or if the people, or if they do all different kinds of things. Okay, so we have, looks like we have almost everybody. I'll give you another 10 or 15 seconds, then I'm going to close the poll. So going once, going twice. Okay, we closed that poll. I think I have one more. I want to do a quick one on acreage. Okay, so this is numbers of acres that you own or manage. So if you're a landowner, it would be ownership acres. If you're a forester or an educator, it would be acres that you manage or otherwise influence. Okay, we'll take another few seconds to do this. Okay, it looks like we have 19 of 25 people have voted. If a few of you that haven't voted could please click the appropriate button, that would be great. These are all diagnostics that I use to help me gauge how to develop my presentations and also to report back to the people that are paying for this service. So this is useful information. Okay, let's close that poll and we'll get on with our presentation. So the starting point is, for those of you that have participated in these webcasts before, I like to try and give us a little bit of ground truthing and ask the question, so what? You know, what's the relevance of a presentation on how to arrange a timber sale? There are lots of reasons for this. Virtually, maybe not virtually, but many forest owners are approached on a regular basis by someone who wants to sell timber, or they realize that they want to sell timber, or want to sell pulpwood, or want to sell firewood. They want to have some kind of commercial activity in their forest land, and they're just not sure how to go about that process. So this is a way to help forest owners understand the process that's going on. Another characteristic of this is landowners will be put in situations where they're trying to figure out whether or not they need a contract, depending upon the type of sale that they're going to have. Landowners wonder what they have to gain, potentially, if they do everything correctly, and at the same time, if there are problems or concerns that they need to avoid in the scale or the scope of those problems or concerns, whether they're just local or regional. So what I'm going to try and do through the process of over the next half an hour to 40 minutes is address some of these issues. And it's really a two-part process. One process, or two-part presentation rather. One part is to characterize the actual process of the sale. The second part is to describe the timber sale contract. So it'll be pretty obvious when we're in one section and when we change to the next. The big picture, just so that you understand where we're going with this, is that you're exchanging some kind of a product for money. And your goal from a landowner's perspective is to achieve whatever objective you have, and that would be an ownership objective. And it might include money, or it might include improving habitats. It might be to improve the growing conditions that exist in a forest by providing more sunlight. It might be simply to create some access roads that are used in the process of extracting the product that you can use for other things, such as for cross-country skiing or for hiking. Some of the concerns associated with this is that there's really no standardized process. Every sale that you have, and the same person could have a sale from one year to the next, and the sale could look very different. The process that you go through could look very different. Your sale this month could be quite different from your neighbor's sale this month. So there's no real standardized process. So we have to try to describe the general framework and give you a context within which you can understand how to proceed. You're working with a potentially high-value product, and if you're not working with, and if the current product that you're trying to sell is not high value, then what you're leaving behind may be a very high value, with the intent being that it's for some future sale. So anytime you're dealing with these high value things, it's certainly the cost benefit concern goes up. Timber sales for most people are an infrequent activity. They may do one every 10 years or one every 30 years. It's quite different than going out and buying a car that you might do on every 5 years or 10 years. And it's infrequent also within your circle of friends. So you may buy a car once every 10 years, but if you have a circle of friends and every couple of years somebody's getting a new car, it's easier for you to keep track of what's going on in the new car markets. So the forest harvesting is kind of something that happens outside of our circle of view, and because of that, it makes it a little more challenging for us to keep track of what the deals, what issues are relevant. As I already mentioned, it's, I think, relatively unique within agricultural within agriculture that you're selling a crop, and at the same time you're selling one crop, you have the potential to put your next crop at risk. I mean, I'm not a traditional agriculturalist, but I don't see that most agricultural sales, whether it's milk sales or beef cattle sales or corn, when you sell one, that you're putting your next crop at risk. So those are some things to be alert to. I also want to give a bit of a disclaimer here. We're going to be talking about foresters, and we're going to be talking about loggers, and we're going to be talking about landowners. A lot of different people factor into the process of a forest harvest. And it's been my experience that every profession, the people that occupy those professions are mostly good people. They're decent people. Everyone's trying to make a living. But that said, truly what we're dealing with, or you'll be dealing with the harvest, is a business transaction. And every business relationship demands that you provide some level of scrutiny just to make sure that you know what's happening. So with that said, and I will try very hard to, when we talk about these different professions, I have no intention of trying to portray one profession or landowners or foresters or loggers as having some generic sort of issues. Rather, it's just people are basically good people, but scrutinize those relationships. Okay, there are some potential costs that you need to be alert to. We've mentioned those a little bit, but here's some very specific things to be alert to. One concern that landowners often have is selling timber at a value that's less than what they could possibly obtain. We talked about that some last month when we were talking about using a forester. We'll talk about that again today. Another concern is that the harvesting that occurs doesn't actually accomplish the goal that you wanted it to accomplish. There are lots of reasons why people will harvest trees. My wife and I have 50 acres in the Adirondacks, and we had we did the cutting and skidding ourselves with the neighbor and his tractor, and the primary reason for doing the harvest, there were several. One was to thin the forest, one was to create trails so that we could get in and remove firewood, and another was to remove some of the very low-end pine trees to be cut into boards. So the concern is that you may not actually recognize what the goal is that you want to accomplish, and that the harvest doesn't proceed in a way that you accomplish that. And then finally, another concern is that in the process of removing some of the trees, you're going to do damage to your residual stand. In this picture that you see in the top right corner, this is actually a relatively small, I mean, it's bigger than you would want, but it's small compared to some damage that you can see in a harvest, where when the skidder drives by, and depending upon how big the logs are, they may bang against some trees. Some of that is to be expected, especially on what are called bumper trees, where the skidder and the logs are turning a corner, but you don't want to see that as a common feature in your forest after the harvest is complete. So another kind of suite of concerns that a landowner may have, or just areas where they need to pay attention, are the legal side of things. So some of the legal implications apply to, especially to those people who are part of a state forest tax law. In New York State, it's called 480 or 480-A, and under New York State 480 and 480-A, when you have a harvest, there's an expectation that you're going to pay a yield tax to the local municipality. If memory serves me, it's a 6% yield tax. So that's a legal obligation that you have and that you need to follow through on. In other states, we have people who are registered from about 20 different states. I'm not familiar with all of those forest tax laws in those states, but virtually every state has a forest tax law, and there may be some legal implications for what you're supposed to do if you're participating in that forest tax program. Another maybe even bigger consideration that some people don't realize is the IRS implications. If you have a timber sale and you sell a forest product and you receive money for that forest product, you are expected to include that as revenue when you file your federal and state tax returns. Now, it's unusual for, at least in New York, it's unusual for loggers and for sawmills to provide I think it's called a 1099 form, the kind of form that says that when somebody gives you money, it's a form that they give you at the end of the tax year that says, here's how much money we gave you. Most loggers and most sawmills don't provide that. You are still obligated under federal law and state laws to report the revenue that you obtain. The IRS is sensitive to this issue. They've done some studies. They've gone back to sawmills and looked to see who on their books they bought logs from, and then they go and check the tax returns of the people who show up on the books of the sawmill to see if they reported revenue. And what they found is that only about 50% of the people who have timber sales actually report that revenue. This is, as you can imagine, is a very large sum of money when you look across the United States, and the IRS is more actively and vigorously pursuing ways to track forest owners down who fail to report. So if you have a timber sale, it's in your best interest to report that income. We can't go into the details of your options when you report that income, but depending upon how you structure your ownership, if you can declare yourself as being in the trade or business, then you have very significant tax advantages, and you can actually, if you've owned your forest land, for example, for more than 12 years, and you have the sale, you can report the income under a capital gains treatment, which gives you a very more favorable tax rate. You can also write off many of the expenses associated with having that timber sale. So I'm not prepared to go into a full description of the opportunities that you have with reporting for IRS, but just suffice it to say that if you work with an accountant or a tax preparer who has experience with timber harvesting, and most of them do not, but find a qualified CPA or tax preparer or a forester who's done this kind of financial work, then you can stand to get quite far ahead with that. Okay, so there are three reasons in my mind that are appropriate for why people should cut trees. And the most important of these is that the cutting should be consistent with the objectives of the owner. We'll talk about some scenarios where this doesn't always play out, but the owner should have should have an explicit knowledge of here's why I own the land. I own the land for recreational access. I own the land because I love wildlife. I own the land because I like to deer hunt and I want the revenue from timber production. Whatever combination of ownership objectives that you have, those should be the factors that drive whether or not you cut trees. And the cutting of trees is whether you do it or whether you contract with somebody to do that. All too often, people have one set of ownership objectives, and as we'll see in a minute, there are examples of times when somebody will show up on your door, knocking on your door, be very pleasant, and they will say, "Hi, I'm so-and-so, and I was taking a walk in your woods, and I see you have some nice trees. I'd like to buy some of them. Here's a check. It's made out in your name for $15,000. And then all of a sudden, the ownership objectives are secondary, and this person is looking at a check. It seems too good to be true because they didn't realize they had that much value in their forest, and so the ownership objectives go out the window. So cutting should be consistent with ownership objectives. Related to that is that harvesting is a tool. Harvesting is not the end point. Harvesting is a means to an end. And ideally, cutting should be initiated by the landowner. So the landowner is familiar with their woods. They may not know the specifics of it, but they may look in the woods, contact a forester, and say, I think that there's an opportunity to do some cutting because I want a recreational trail. I want to build a barn. I've heard down at the local diner that the price of such and such is up, and part of my objective is to produce timber and revenue. So whatever it is that triggers it, hopefully it's the landowner that triggers it, or the landowner is at least very much involved in that process. There are also some good reasons not to cut trees, and these relate to the two ways that you motivate people to do something. People talk about motivation through fear and greed, or fear versus temptation. So there are lots of stories, and you all have probably heard more than I have heard, about a log buyer or timber buyer who shows up your door and says, "I'm in the neighborhood, it'll be 12 months before I'm back in the area," or somebody will tell you that the trees need to be cut because they're over-mature. There's no, the need to cut and over-mature is relative to what your ownership objectives are. So that's not in and of itself a reason to cut. And there's also the concern that prices might drop. And prices do drop. Currently, the price of sugar maple is down from what it used to be. A year and a half to 2 years ago, the price of red oak fell. Those prices will fluctuate. They're like any other market-driven resource. Sometimes prices are up and prices are down. Over the long run, the prices for high-value saw timber have continued to go up. So those are the fear reasons. There are also opportunities to avoid being tempted. And it may be that you're walking through your woods with your neighbor, and your neighbor says, "Hey, your trees are 12 inches in diameter on the bud end, on the stump end. You can sell that tree." So the temptation is, yes, I want to sell this tree. The temptation may be that your neighbor or somebody else lets you know that there's a log buyer or a logger who's in the vicinity, and it seems like it's the temptation is there. They're handy. They're nearby. You can get the work done quickly. You're tempted by the fact that prices are up, or maybe just that somebody plants the seed of opportunity and says, you could sell some trees. So those are you may hear those reasons and be alert to those and conscious of those, but fall back on, what are my objectives? Why do I own my forest? What am I trying to accomplish with my forest? And then go from there to decide whether or not it's time to cut your trees. Okay, let me pause there for a second and just see if anybody has any questions. So if you have a question, you need to type it into the chat pod on the left-hand side of the screen. Okay, well, here we go. Are there any websites that track timber prices over time? Great question. I'm glad you mentioned that, because there was a point I was thinking about that I'd already forgotten that I wanted to make, and I may bring it up later. There are, every state, and I'm not sure what state you're located in, Al, but every state has what's called a stumpage price report. This is either produced by the state forestry agency, which in New York, it's the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, or it may be produced by a land-grant university, such as, I think in Pennsylvania, I think Penn State University produces it. So what you would do is, if you go online and do an internet search for New York stumpage price report, and the word that I'm saying, just so that you can see it, is, I'll type it in, stumpage price report. Do a search for that word, give it the state, and most states now, I think, are having electronic versions, online versions. New York just went to an online version within the last year, maybe within the last 6 months. I might have a link to that on my forestconnect.info site. If not, the DEC, the State Department of Environmental Conservation, has it on their website. So so that's one piece of the answer. Another part of that answer, there are companies, and I've only heard of them. I've just learned of this last week, so I may be a little shaky on the details, but there are companies, at least one that I know of, in the southern part of the United States. This one was based in South Carolina, that go through the process of tracking timber sales. And they collect data from the timber buyers, they collect data from the forest owners, they collect timber from the sawmills, the pricing information, and they keep track of a number of different attributes. So they'll keep track of whether it's a small private landowner that's selling to a logger. They'll keep track of whether it's a large forest landholding industry that's selling to a sawmill. They'll keep track of whether it was a summertime sale versus a wintertime sale, so a variety of different attributes. And you can subscribe if you're interested, and this is something particularly that foresters might do, or other log buyers, people representing forest owners, would subscribe to this, and they can just essentially get a reality check. So if they put timber sale up to bid, which we'll talk about here in a second, if they put timber up to bid, then they can check it against the database and see, do the bids that I'm receiving, are these in the ballpark, or do I need to do something different? Have I created a situation that's made this sale particularly unpalatable to buyers, and I need to try something differently? So I've never heard of this in the Northeast, but if there are any of you who are in the South, Alabama, South Carolina, Georgia, that area, you might look for one of these if this is, or if you're working with a forester, talk to a forester and see what kinds of services like that are available. Okay, so now let's, so Al, does that cover the question that you had? Okay, let's jump ahead now and think about who's involved in the forest harvesting process. The first two are kind of the obvious two players or actors. The landowner, which mostly is what you all are today as an audience. Again, your function here is to make sure that the cutting is going to meet your objectives. And forestry does not happen without a logger. And loggers, unfortunately, get a bad rap, but most of the loggers that I know are decent people. And if you communicate with them and talk with them, then you actually can develop a very good relationship. And their skills are that they know or should know how to cut down trees, buck them into length, skid them to a landing, load them, and haul them to a mill. Some loggers also have some training in forestry. Not all loggers do, so depending upon how you initiate the relationship with the logger, understand what specific skills they have. Last month we talked about the role that a forester has, and the forester should be serving to some extent the landowner as a landowner's agent. Now the forester may work for a sawmill, which would be an industrial forester, and then that forester is also serving the interests of the mill, but make sure that it's very clear what the relationship is that you have with your forester. And then finally, several years ago when I started developing this presentation, I didn't include this fourth bullet of being the public as a group that's involved in the process of timber harvesting, forest harvesting, but they are in two different capacities. One is there is an implicit social license, and the communities have increasingly become concerned where harvesting occurs and the people don't understand what's involved in forest harvesting. Those of you that own forest land recognize that you have some level of private property rights. You're paying taxes, in many cases, very large sums of taxes to own that forest land, and you expect to be able to do the things that you want to do on that property within reason. Well, your neighbors view your land as their viewshed, and so even though they may not be making any financial investment in your property, there are increasingly numbers of peoples who want to influence the kinds of things that you do on your property. So the manner in which you execute a harvest on your property has important bearing on the license that you hold from your local community. The way they affect change is through municipal ordinances, and for people who are located particularly in the lower Hudson region, the area more or less between Albany and New York City, and as I've heard in some parts of the southern tier of New York, there are municipalities, towns, mostly towns, that enact harvesting ordinances that are potentially create limitations for forest owners who want to harvest trees. So the role of the public is not to be understated. So there are four key players. Your role, again, in laying this out more explicitly and specifically, is you need to select a forester. We talked about that last week. If you missed that broadcast, you can go to my Forest Connect website and view it. There's also written material that you can use. You need to talk with your forester and confirm that the harvesting will meet your objectives, and specifically ask the question to your forester, here's what I want to accomplish. How will this harvest meet my objectives? If your objectives are wildlife habitat, ask the question, how will this harvest help me reach my objectives for improving wildlife habitat? And if you want specific types of wildlife habitat, then say specifically, I'm interested in ovenbirds, or I'm interested in white-tailed deer and turkey, or I'm interested in whatever. Ask those questions. If you have a desired outcome or any restrictions, it's your obligation to be upfront with your forester and with your logger so that there are no surprises at the end. Once the contract is signed, and we'll talk about the contract, you need to be, those desired outcomes and restrictions need to be specific. You need to understand the written contract, and you need to understand that you remain in the driver's seat. It's your land. You may sell the trees, but it's still your land, and the contract will grant some type of access to your land for the logger or the sawmill to extract the wood, but you're still in the land, you're still in the contract, you're still in the driver's seat, and the contract helps you protect your land. Okay, the forester's role, and this is from a landowner's perspective, is the forester needs to represent the landowner and the land. needs to inventory the resource to know what's available, should mark the boundaries of the sale, should mark in any trails or roads and trees, mark the trees that are going to be cut, will develop and distribute what's called a prospectus. The prospectus is a written document that says, here's a forest owner. Forest owner Smith is offering X number of trees for sale here, and describe the trees that are for sale, give a general description of the property, and then that prospectus is mailed out to people who are potential buyers, and they are given a date by which they need to submit a written bid, and they bid on what's described in the prospectus. It may be that they want to come out and look at the trees in advance of making a bid, which is, I think, a good thing to do if you're a buyer. And if you're interested in seeing what an example of a prospectus is, if you go to my website, the forestconnect.info website, I've posted there a kind of a generic prospectus, an example of one that came from the Arnott Forest. So it's not, obviously the details of it would apply only to that particular sale, but it gives you an idea of the kinds of things that might be included in a prospectus. The forester would typically advertise the sale by mailing out. They'll have a mailing list. They'll mail the prospectus to 15 or 20 or 50 different potential buyers, and then advise the landowners on the quality of the bids and the history that the bidders have in being able to deliver on the contract. They may or may not administer and supervise the sale depending upon what you ask the forester to do. They may then do a final inspection and return the bond after the logging contractor or the mill has met the extent of the contract. So who talks to who? How do you initiate this process? The best way to do it is for the forest owner to contact the forester, or vice versa. If it's the forester has the owner as an existing client, and say, I was looking at your work schedule, and I see that in 2008 there's a possibility that we'll want to have a sale. I'd like to come out and do an inspection of the area that we were thinking about, and get things lined up and see whether or not it makes sense to have a sale in 2008. Or it may be that a buyer contacts an owner, and this is the way many sawmills and mills do business, is they have a sense of who's present in the, who has a forest property in their woodshed. They drive around, they look and see what's going on. They go to the town clerk, find out the owner, and they'll contact the owner and say, hey, would you like to sell some trees? The owner can think about, again, whether or not that a harvest would fit with their objectives, and then contact their forester to see if a harvest makes sense given their objectives. What you should avoid is where you just respond spontaneously to a buyer, and specifically be careful if a buyer contacts an owner and has you sign a contract that transfers ownership of trees, and then that buyer can then potentially sell that contract to somebody that you don't know, and then you have a signed contract, which is a legal document, and then you get into a lot of potentially very painful scenarios. So stay with these top 3 scenarios as your best bet. Okay, let's look at a couple of scenarios, and we'll play out how they really fit with what the owner's objectives are. When I give this presentation in person, we'd have a little dialogue. We won't be able to do that today, but I think you'll see where we're going. So scenario 1, landowner Smith is approached by a buyer who's already marked some trees. His skidder is in the area, and the buyer has a check made out for $7,000 payable to Robert and Irma Smith. So that's one scenario, and a relatively common scenario. I hear a handful of times every year about somebody who's gone onto a property. They've marked some trees with paint, and they show up at the landowner and say, I've marked some trees. Here's a contract I'd like you to sign. Here's a check made out in your name. get this sale up and running. Another scenario is where the Mr. and Mrs. Jones are reviewing their stewardship plan. They've worked on a plan over a number of years with their forester. They see that their work schedule suggests a sale assessment. I didn't update the dates here, but you can say the sale assessment in 2007 with a possible sale in 2008. So they contact their forester. They review with their forester what their ownership objectives are. The forester looks at the stand, advises them on whether or not they should have a sale. The forester marks the trees and then works through a bidding process to advertise their sale. So these are, you can probably see where I'm going with these answers, but we can compare those two scenarios. In all likelihood, we can say whose ownership's objectives were better met. Well, in most likelihood, it's the second scenario where the owners started by thinking about what their objectives were. The second question, which landowner received more revenue, that's not quite so clear. We don't know which landowner received more revenue. It may be that the money that was offered was actually more, in the first scenario, was more than what the second landowner received, but the second landowner's objectives may have been an improvement cut to remove low-grade hardwoods and to utilize that as firewood. The total value, though, may be much higher because they're sitting on residual high-value hardwoods that are continuing to grow and mature versus the first scenario where trees may have been cut prematurely. Which harvest was more sustainable? Again, it's hard to say based on the information that we have, but typically where you have a forester involved and the forester administers the sale, you have a better probability of having a sustainable harvest that meets the desired outcome of the forest owner. Okay, we'll cut to the chase now. Everybody's always quite interested in what payment options happen. There are three different ways that you can typically be paid when you think about selling trees. By far and away, the best way to be paid is what's called a lump sum upfront timber sale. That's where you advertise a number of trees being sold, or even if you don't advertise, if you and your forester are talking with the logger, you say, we have 100 marked trees, you're paid in advance for the total amount of whatever that product is. So it's essentially like going to the grocery store. You go to the grocery store, you fill up your cart, you go to the checkout, you pay for those items before you take them off the property. The difference is that in the grocery store, you pick what you're going to buy. With a lump sum sale, the best way to do that is for you and your forester to decide which trees are going to be cut, and then you offer those. The analogy here is if you have a yard sale or a garage sale, you typically, I hope, don't let people walk into your house and decide what items they want to buy. You've already pre-selected the items that you want to make available for sale. The advantage of the lump sum sale is that when the logger shows up on your property, the logger owns the trees. You've already been paid for those trees. There are two or three very significant benefits to that. One, you've already been paid, so if the weather turns bad and the ground is soft and there's a lot of rain, you can, or your forester can say, and this would be a contract consideration, you would say, the contract says no logging during wet weather, you need to come back in 2 or 3 months. If the logger is doing one of the other payment options, such as a percentage or what's called a scaled or shares, then they'd say, all right, well, if you don't want any money, then you don't want any money. I can come back and maybe it'll be 3 months, maybe it'll be 10 months. And so you're put into a compromised position if you're not in a lump sum situation. Another advantage is that with a lump sum, you as the landowner have a very clear relationship with the logger. The logger owns the trees, you don't own the trees, the logger is not your employee. As we'll see with those other two scenarios, it's potential that the potential exists that you could be considered the employer for the logger who's cutting the trees. If you've not been paid for the wood, even though you have a contract, then you may need to defend whether or not the logger that's cutting the trees is your employee. If they're your employee, you may be responsible for paying workers' compensation. If they have problems, if their tractor trailer with the logs, has an accident on the road, they're carrying your trees, you carry a greater liability for the things that happen. All things being equal, the lump sum sale is the very best way to go. There are some situations with custom logging where you have you hire a logger to perform a harvest for you, and you pay the logger for services rendered. So you pay that logger so many dollars per 1,000 board feet, and that's what the MBF is, 1,000 board feet. You pay the logger $175 or $200 per 1,000 board feet, or so many dollars per ton, to cut and skid and haul the wood. You own the trees, and the trees go to the mill. So it's essentially a contractual service that you have. Situations where this works well is if you're working with a very sensitive or highly restrictive timber harvest. We've had timber harvests like that at the Cornell University Arnott Forest, where we're cutting research plots, and there are so many restrictions that we have in place that no logger in their right mind would pay for the wood and have to deal with all those restrictions. So we essentially hire them on a per unit basis, and then they transport the trees, we market the trees, they transport the trees. Okay, I need to talk faster, we're going to run out of time. Scaled or shares is the way loggers like to do it. They'll say, all right, 50-50, 60-40, 40-60. They come in and they do the harvest. The problem with that is that it's a very difficult arrangement for you to monitor. If it's a 50-50 sale, they know where all that wood went, and you may or may not, unless you're sitting there and counting every tractor trailer load of logs that leaves, it's hard for you to know how many logs went out your driveway. The other thing is that, and you hear lots of these bad stories, and I don't want to dwell on them because there are lots of good stories, but there are people every year that get burned very badly by selling on shares or selling scaled. So the punchline here is that you need to work with a forester who's familiar with the local culture of how to effectively arrange a sale. That's your very best bet. Typically, you would sell wood on the stump as stumpage. Some people are adamant, they own a tractor, they want to cut their own trees down, they're not going to do any damage, they want to sell them roadside. My universal recommendation is to avoid this kind of a situation, because once those trees are on the ground, you're obligated to sell them. If you cut the trees and the nearby mill closes down, they don't want the trees, you now have trees that are quickly going from potentially high quality saw logs into a firewood category. So when you sell on the stump, you put it out to bid. If nobody buys them, you're still in a good place, it's a good situation, because those trees are continuing to grow. Okay, I'm gonna run out of time, so I just want to generally give you this notion. There are a couple of things that go into how you're going to sell, how you're going to configure your sale, and it's based on value and volume. If you have on the good end of the spectrum, is you have high value and high volume. Those are easy sales to execute. On the low end is where you have a low value or a low volume. You have both low value and low volume. It's really, that's the stuff that's left at the end of the day at your yard sale that nobody wants. It's really hard to move. The temptation with forestry is that you sweeten the pot. So you've marked the trees based on your ownership objectives. Nobody's buying or nobody's bidding, and so your temptation is, well, I'll mark a few extra trees and we'll make sure that these get sold. I strongly advise against doing that unless you have some very compelling reason to do it, and it fits well with your ownership objectives. Your two options, or three options that you can work with there, are try and do a negotiated sale. So nobody bids on it. The log buyers and loggers have lots of things. They're busy people just like all of us are. They see a sale that comes across low volume, low value, they may not be interested in bidding on it. But if you call them up, or your forester calls them up and says, hey, we've got such and such of a sale, let's work out a deal. Then maybe they can say, all right, well, I can't get to it for 8 months. If you can wait until then yeah, I'm interested. And then you can go into the contract process. You can do it yourself, which is, for example, what my wife and I did this past weekend, actually. And we worked with a neighbor who had a tractor and a farming winch, and we cut and skid ourselves. Because we were working with low volume, we had about 2,000 board feet and very, very low value. So that was our only option. Okay, pricing and revenue. Sale price increases with competition and knowledge. That's kind of an understood. The more competition there is for a product, the more likely that it is that you're going to get the fair market value. The more knowledgeable a logger or a log buyer is, the more comfortable they're going to feel in bidding a fair price for your logs. Quality and quantity are the two key things that affect how much somebody will offer to buy your trees, but there are lots of costs and revenue potentials that influence what really happens. So you may have a timber sale that looks almost identical to your neighbor's when you just look at the numbers, but you get two very different prices. It's because your sale may have happened in March and your neighbor's sale may have happened in November. It may be that you have existing access roads and your neighbor doesn't have any access roads. There are 17 different factors at least, and these are listed on the New York State on the stumpage price report, 17 different factors that influence costs and potential revenues. The confidence that the logger has in the quality based on his experience working in your area, costs that the forester may have, and then a key one is what resources you have, such as access roads, and what constraints you impose. So you need to know what your objectives are. You need to match the harvesting activity to your objectives to make sure they meet. Make sure that you mark your boundaries in your trees, market the trees and select the buyer, refine the contract, and then administer the sale. So that's the end of the first part. In the contract will need to go through fairly quickly here. There are 4 basic parts. The opening section, let me back up. A timber contract is who is selling what to who, for how much, when does it happen, where does it happen, and what are the restrictions. Pretty standard, in my mind, contract issues. There's an opening section, a second section that would describe the property and the timber, any terms of the sale, and then it's useful to have something on language and glossary. And again, there's examples of that at forestconnect.info. Okay, the opening section, standard kinds of things, the first 4 items. The 5th item, it's important to include a section, just a basic statement that said that the logger is operating as a subcontractor and is not an employee of the landowner. And all of this, keep in mind, I'm a forester and an educator. I'm not a lawyer. The contract needs to be reviewed by a lawyer. So I'm just giving you some issues that you can bring up to discuss with your lawyer. Describing the property includes things such as geographic location. The logger is going to want you to provide assurance that you own the property that the logger is going to be operating on. You will describe the product that's being sold, and it may just be that you can refer in the contract to the prospectus, and then the specific terms of the contract, the payment schedule, the termination date. Typically, timber sales will have a termination date of 12 to 18 months after the signing of the contract, with the opportunity for extension if there's something that's happened, bad weather or things like that. The terms of the sale, and this is really the heart of what happens, all of these are negotiable. These are all things that you need to customize for your situation at the time when you're having the sale. So the sale that you have in 2007 may have a different set of terms than the sale that you have in 2010 or that you had in 1993. Typically, you would want to have some kind of a consideration for the use of best management practices. There would be some potential for penalty for damage to the residual stand, particularly cutting unmarked trees. Whether or not they need to cut the non-merchantable trees that are marked, what the specific amount of the performance bond is. Certainly you want to make sure that that contract is non-transferable. And if you do an internet search and find some examples of those timber sales contracts, you'll see dozens and dozens of potential terms. So as we kind of wrap this up, I'd advise against accepting an unsolicited bid where somebody just knocks on your door and says, I think your trees are worth $10,000, here's a check. Make sure that you have a qualified forester. Make sure that the seller, not the buyer, chooses the trees to be cut. Never go into a sale without having a contract and a performance bond. Make sure that your logger provides you, it's called a certificate of liability insurance. That the payment should happen prior to the cutting, and evaluate whether or not you want to take the highest bid or the best bid. The person that bids the highest may not actually be the best person to work in your woods. And just because somebody bids low does not mean they're trying to take advantage of you. They may just not have access to the markets that the high bidder has. And then finally, be careful with including unnecessary sale constraints. These are just because you see a sale constraint, such as lopping the tops of trees, doesn't mean that you should necessarily use it. Discuss all of those contract constraints with your forester and see if they make sense relative to your objectives. So that, I think, closes us out. Oh, here's our closing poll. Let's see if we can get you to take the closing poll. Oh boy, we got a long list of them here. So the top half is, pick one of those options, and then what I'm looking for in the bottom half is for you to let me know what kinds of things you're going to be doing. And the bottom half may be independent of what we specifically talked about today. Okay, and we have, while you're doing that, we have a question from Stephen. And Stephen says, what is considered acceptable damage within a woodlot? I don't have a good answer for that. I can tell you some examples. Oh, let me expand this so we can see what we're... Okay, we'll take one question at a time. Stephen's first, acceptable damage. I'll say it's virtually impossible to cut trees, have them fall on the ground, drag them behind a skidder or a tractor, and not do some damage to the forest. So what's acceptable depends a little bit on the nature of the sale. If you have a really dense forest and you're cutting the biggest trees, then you're going to have a higher level of damage. If you have a forest that's been managed through time, there's a lot of space between the trees. You're cutting the smaller trees with the smaller crowns, and you have well-established skid trails. You have bumper trees already in place at the corners where you bend. The skidder has to go around the corner. You can have relatively little damage. And it really comes down to the operator. The logger that's doing the job has a huge influence on whether or not what the extent of damage that you have. So it's a good idea if you're working with a logger when you're selling it that you want to go visit 2 or 3 recent harvests where that logger has worked and walk through the woods. You'll need to, of course, talk to the landowner in advance, but go out and visit. The other thing to do is walk in the woods with the logger and your forester before the logger starts cutting, and express to that logger your greatest concern or your great concern with avoiding damage. And that, for me and my property, that's, I'm trying to improve the forest. The trees that I'm cutting are the low-grade trees. I don't want to take a tree that's worth 50 cents and bang up a tree that in the future may be worth $250. It doesn't make sense. So this is it. I can't give a specific answer to that because it's so case specific. But you shouldn't walk in and see dozens of trees per acre banged up. You will see bumper trees that have damage on them, because if you have a skidder and the skidder is 25 feet long and it may be pulling a 32-foot log behind it, you can't make a right angle corner with that kind of length. So you have to have bumper trees, and the bumper trees will get banged up. Okay, Richard recommends landowners sell using the lump sum method. Pine thinnings and small sales are typically not bought that way. That is absolutely correct. It puts the landowner in an uncomfortable situation. Well, because you're trying to, and I'm guessing the uncomfortable situation is you're trying to get somebody to buy something that's of very low value. What do I suggest a landowner do in these cases to prevent being taken advantage of? And the question there is money received. That's really difficult. And that's kind of in the, remember that box that I showed you, you were in the lower right-hand corner there. It depends a lot on local markets and what you have to work with. It may be that you have one area that's 5 acres or 25 acres, and you have some low-value pine there that nobody wants to buy. And it may be that in your management plan you thought that you were going to harvest in stand number 1 in 2008, and you're going to harvest in stand number 6 in 2010, and it may be that by moving both of those stands into 2009, you can accomplish your objectives and create enough volume to get somebody's attention. So that's just one kind of off-the-cuff scenario. This is where your forester earns their keep, by helping advise you on ways that you can accomplish your objectives and have a sale that is profitable for you and fair for you, and fair for the logger. You don't want to take advantage of the loggers, but also don't, they can look out for themselves, but I wouldn't advise somebody to take advantage of or exploit somebody else. Patrick's question is, how much do forester services usually cost? I'll need to defer the long answer to the web conference that we had last month, and you can go to my website and view that. Foresters typically charge either on a commission or on a flat rate. My recommendation is to try and work with a forester on a flat rate, and the prices will range. Most of the ones that I've heard about are less than $100 per hour, which when you first hear that sounds like a lot of money, but that's the 2 foresters that I've recently talked to charging on an hour. Charge about what my mechanic charges on a per hour basis. And if you're working with a forester that's in the $50 to $100 per hour, and you have a timber sale that's worth $20,000, that sale, their services are going to be 1 or 2% of the value of that sale, which is a very small amount. The commission sales are typically much higher than that 1 or 2%. Okay, so Al's comment, there's a fifth interested party for some of us, the conservation easement owning agency. Very good. Conservation easements are increasingly common. This is where you sit with your lawyer and look at the specific restrictions that are imposed by that conservation easement. In a case like this, the best solution is to be as communicative as you possibly can, and keep them alert in advance, and make sure that they know what you're doing, and that you're specifically, here are our objectives. Our objectives include satisfying the conservation easement. Here's how we're going to make sure that we're not going to be in violation of our conservation easement. I think if you do something like that, then you will be, that's a step in the right direction. What you wouldn't want to do, of course, is, try and pull this off probably behind their back, because you have a legal document, so they have a very powerful tool to put you in hot water if you do things that you're not supposed to. So let me I have to bring this to a close, and I'll bring back that pod that has the notes. It has the dates on it for some events. In about 3 minutes, I have a group of people here at the Arnott Forest that we have a woods walk, and I need to go get ready for that. So I'll be closing this down. The dates are here. What I'd welcome you to do is to email me if you have additional follow-up questions. Okay, here's Mike says the 25th August wood walk is intended to highlight conservation easements. So if you're anywhere in the Springwater area, which is, I believe, Livingston County or very close to Livingston County, that would be a good one to go check out. Please email me any questions that you have. I will respond to the question, and I will also post that question to my web blog. And if you go to my forestconnect.info, there's a button at the top of that page that will take you straight to my weblog. So thank you all. I hope you have a great afternoon, and I'll look to see you back here in mid-September. We have the September webcast is going to be on firewood production. So if you haven't already, then certainly by then you'll be thinking about firewood. So have a great afternoon, and I'm going to turn off the recording.